In an ecological community, some species have a larger impact on the community than others. And that may be because there are just a ton of them. They are very, very abundant, but sometimes they're not necessarily that abundant. They just happen to play a particularly pivotal role in community dynamics. If they are very, very abundant, more so than other species, we tend to call them the dominant species. If they have just the highest biomass or the most abundance. And one example of this is sugar maples. They have a major impact on shading and soil nutrient for the rest of the forests in eastern North America, and that has a big effect on how other plant species are distributed. So these organisms have an outsized effect, but it's because they are abundant, because there are just a lot of them. And again, they shade and adjust soil nutrition for other organisms. Some dominant species might be particularly good at exploiting resources and outcompeting other potential dominant species. Sometimes they might just be good at avoiding predators. But sometimes what becomes the dominant species are invasive species, and it's because they may land in a place that they do well in. It's could be part of their fundamental niche, I suppose. And if it's a new place, there might not be any predators or any diseases that affect them, and so they run wild. So one example of this is kudzu in the southern United States, southeastern United States. Was introduced as an ornamental plant and also to hold back erosion from Japan, and it just took over. Or around here, honeysuckle, which I love. When I was a kid, it's got sweet flowers that you can eat, and it's kind of pretty, but man, does it take over, and it is not native here. So it has become a dominant species because it's invasive, it's not from here, and it lacks predators and disease. Sometimes a particular species has an outsized role in a community, not because of its abundance. It's not the dominant species, but because of something about its niche, its ecological role. So they're not necessarily abundant, but they have a huge impact on the structure of the community, and we call these keystone species. One example of this is a sea star named Pisaster, and this is actually a sea star that was featured in a number of videos when we were looking at invertebrates, because they are a predator that eat a bunch of invertebrates, like mollusks, for instance. And they eat a lot of mussels. And so when they are present, they keep these mussels under control, and those mussels don't then ravage the primary producers, and you're able to have a nice biodiverse ecosystem, a nice diverse community. Without Pisaster, without the sea star, the mussels go wild and outcompete everything else to eat the producers, and you end up only having 2 or 3 species in that community. It decimates the biodiversity. And so, because their presence matters this much, even though they are not themselves super abundant, they're not the dominant species, they are a keystone species. Another example of this are sea otters in some sort of northwest Pacific coast kelp communities. In the same way that coral is really important for coral reef communities, kelp is really important for kelp forests. Like trees and coral, it provides structure for a lot of other organisms to live in. But sea urchins eat kelp. Sea urchins themselves are eaten by otters. And so when otters are present, you tend to have far fewer sea urchins and far more kelp. When the sea urchins are not eaten by otters, so otter populations dip, sea urchin populations explode, and they eat the kelp, and that causes the biodiversity in that community to go down. So sea otters are sort of this top predator that is a keystone species because it helps maintain these kelp forests. That said, otters have started to go down because a new top predator has appeared. It's not that they weren't there before, but killer whales used to eat other things. They used to eat whales. And because of the destruction of whales over the last many decades, they've needed to look for a new food source. They've started to eat otters. Otters then are lower in population, which means they're not eating sea urchins, which explode, which means kelp goes down and biodiversity drops. So it's all interconnected, but these sea otters have an outsized impact. Some species have an outsized impact because they are ecosystem engineers, which means they physically change the environment and affect the community structure in that way. And the classic example of this are beavers. Beavers create dams, and those dams can adjust the flow of streams that a lot of organisms rely on, and that can transform the landscape. Here you can see a beaver producing a dam. And again, so because of the structural, physical impact that they have on the environment around them, they have an outsized impact on their communities. Now, you may look at that and think, wow, I know of another organism that because of the way it constructs things and physically changes the world around it, it affects the community of organisms. And that would, of course, be us. We, more than any organism in the history of the Earth, so far as we know, have changed the land around us, right? We live in cities, or at least towns, where we build houses and roads and things like that. And that obviously can have a big impact on the community of organisms that we live amongst. When studying ecological communities, some scientists tend to focus on a bottom-up model of organization, meaning that the bottom layers, like the producers, have the most influence on the community. And this makes a lot of sense because the producers are the only ones that can capture energy from the sun and allow it to be passed up. So primary producers are very, very important for the structure of a community. And in this case, the presence or absence of particular mineral nutrients can dictate which primary producers and how many of them can grow, and that will really impact the community structure. So that's your bottom-up model. In more recent times, there's been a lot of focus on a top-down model. This is the trophic cascade model that proposes that a lot of this control of what the community looks like comes from the top predators. And this is because predators control herbivores, which in turn control primary producers. And so the thing that limits primary producers isn't just the minerals in the soil, right? It could be how many herbivores are present, and that is impacted by the presence of predators. This has led to conservation ecologists to occasionally do things like biomanipulation, right? Intentionally adding organisms, for instance, or adjusting a community, usually using predators, to adjust what a community looks like. So in a Finnish lake, there had been blooms of cyanobacteria, these primary producers, that occurred because zooplankton were gone. They were eaten by roachfish, which are secondary consumers. And these blooms don't sound bad. It means lots of nutrients in the lake. But again, they bloom and they die, and then they get eaten up by microbes, and that sucks the oxygen out of the lake, and a lot of things die. So they added pike perch, which are tertiary consumers, which then ate the roachfish, which then didn't eat quite as many of the zooplankton, which then were able to eat some of the cyanobacteria, which ended the blooms. And so these are complex interactions, but your fish eat the zooplankton and eat the algae, right? So if your fish are abundant, then the algae are abundant, right? And if your fish are rare, then the algae are rare. Now, we should be careful about biomanipulation because we've screwed this up in the past, but sometimes it works out very well. For instance, in Yellowstone, there used to be wolves in Yellowstone, and they were killed over the last century or two by settlers who didn't want them eating their sheep, for instance. But that meant that grazing animals went out of control and ate off and decimated the primary producing population. And in the decades since, wolves have been reintroduced to Yellowstone and the area around it. It really has been marvelous for the biodiversity in the area. It's worked out very well. Communities also occasionally undergo disturbances, and where you destroy a bunch of the life for somehow, right? It could be a forest fire or a volcanic eruption or something as simple as a tree falling over that will be a very small disturbance in a very localized area. And decades ago, most ecologists thought that communities tended to be in a state of equilibrium. They were where they were and they were stable. They were climax communities. And some people thought these climax communities more or less operated as a superorganism. But other ecologists since then have challenged this idea that communities are usually at equilibrium, and they've put forward, with a lot of recent evidence supporting it, a non-equilibrium model, which describes communities as constantly changing, meaning you have a disturbance, you start to recover from that disturbance, you have another disturbance, not necessarily a big one. Doesn't mean that we're having constant forest fires or volcanic eruptions, but windstorms that knock over some trees, right? Or a small fire, things like that. And this idea is that a disturbance changes a community, removes some organisms from it, alters resource availability in some way, and then the community has to respond to that disturbance. And disturbances can be characterized by their intensity, right? High-level disturbance is a result of high intensity and high frequency, right? But lower intensity, lower frequency can be a smaller level disturbance. Fire is a great example of this. You can have very, very intense fires that decimate ecosystems, or you can have very, very small fires that don't so much decimate them. And in recent decades, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis has been put forward, which suggests that moderate levels of disturbance, right, not super intense, right, but moderate levels of disturbance in intensity and frequency can foster greater diversity than either high or low levels of disturbance, right? Obviously, high levels of disturbance can be bad for biodiversity because you kill everything off, right? It's hard to come back from that. But low levels of disturbance, you intuitively might think that low levels of disturbance might mean more biodiversity. But it turns out that when you have low levels of diversity, certain species kind of take over and establish themselves. And these slow-growing species that establish themselves then kind of outcompete everything else. When you have moderate levels of disturbance, you can make room for different species that may be faster growing, for instance. And there was one example of a study looking at this question in New Zealand that looked at the richness of invertebrate taxa based on the intensity of flooding. And it was in streams that had an intermediate intensity of flooding where you found the highest biodiversity. So this x-axis here shows you the intensity of the disturbances, right, the floods in this case, and the number of taxa that you find, and it tends to be more in this intermediate disturbance. Again, because in very established communities, you've already sort of outcompeted, blocked out a lot of different kinds of organisms from growing and existing sorry, that's down here, my fault. And up here, very intense disturbances can just kill off a bunch of things. But in intermediate, it kind of creates several different kinds of areas in a community and lots of different niches for different organisms to live in. I talked about Yellowstone earlier with regard to wolves, but Yellowstone also had a huge fire in 1988, and so it is an example of a non-equilibrium community. And you've been able to do a lot of studying of this national park to see how big natural areas respond to massive disturbances. And it began to come back quickly. This is 1 year after the fire. Now, if you backed up, you'd still see lots of burnt trees, right? And I've been to Yellowstone since then, and it really, really has come back. You can still see evidence of the fire from 30 years ago, but it looks very healthy. I actually used to work at a camp in California that burned down. About half the camp burned down. And it was just dreadful. And I remember coming back the next year, and it was a little bit hopeful because you see all these new flowers that wouldn't have been able to pop up before when they were shaded out by trees, right? But they pop up and they begin the process of coming back. And this process of coming back is called ecological succession, coming back from a disturbance. Primary succession is what we call coming back from a huge disturbance where no soil exists. A huge fire or volcanic eruption or giant storm. Secondary succession is when you're coming back from a relatively mild disturbance where you still have at least soil and sometimes some plants. And we're going to get into these types of succession in the next video.